Hey, welcome to Start and Restart. Um, Today, what we're going to be talking about is something that I like to call the 8 ideas that connect you with God. And here's why we're starting here. There's all sorts of things that Christians talk about that may help your spiritual life. There's Bible reading and good conduct, but the reality is that if your connection with God isn't actually solid, none of those things will actually help. So we want to start here because this is actually the single most important thing that I can show you. And it might not be, if you're new to this or somebody else you know is new to this, it might not just be one moment where you watch this and suddenly over the line. I want to invite you into a space where you can actually wrestle with this, where you can actually consider and pay close attention to your questions. And so, two things that I want you to be paying attention to as I go down this list of 8 ideas that connect you with God. Two things. First, where on an intellectual level do you find yourself hung up and you say, I have a hard time believing and thinking that that's true, that either doesn't make sense to me or it doesn't seem true? The second thing I want you to pay attention to is on a gut level, maybe you feel compelled, but on a gut or a heart level, what just seems to not to resonate with you? It bothers you deeply. I want to invite you to pay close attention wherever you are in your spiritual walk to where those hangups are. Because in the coming weeks, we're going to spend time discussing, I think, what are a very set of predictable and normal questions that a lot of people have when they consider these questions or these ideas. And then from here, we're going to start talking about how it is that you start a spiritual walk and all sorts of stuff like that. So let's start with this. The 8 ideas that connect you to God. Um, First one, as a result of the fall, human beings are sinful and do not measure up. I want you to suppose for a moment that you could draw a line in the sand, or maybe you look outside and you see that there's a road next door to you. And I want you to imagine that on the other side of that line or on the other side of that road, there is a world that is utterly perfect. And if there's a good God, then that good God would want a world that is free of suffering, free of brokenness, that is essentially a paradise. That's what a good God would want for you, right? So I want you to imagine that world as vividly as you possibly can. Here's a couple of details just to start you thinking. For one thing, people on that side of the road, they've never had locks on their doors because they've probably never been worried that anybody would come in uninvited. And if they did, they've never worried that person would be up to something wrong. They have never once had to question what they're being told, wondering that it's some sort of an untruth because they can't even imagine that that would be the case. In dealings with one another, they never have to stop and look out for their own interests because, frankly, there's nobody who's ever looking to take advantage of them. In a word, it would be calm. Now, let me ask, with the flaws that you have, if you were to cross over to that side of the road and start hanging out with those people, how long do you suppose it would take for you to start ruining their good time? I mean, I can say personally, I can imagine a number of things that I would do and say that would actually start to tarnish paradise. You see, I'm part of the problem. The reason that our world isn't like that world, part of that reason is because of me. There are things that I know I should not do that I do. And internally, there's a heart in me that even when I don't do those things, I have the potential for all of that inside of me. Given the right circumstances, I'm capable of far worse things than I even think. And so if there's a good God, he would have a problem with me. Romans 3:23 puts it this way, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so as a result of the fall, human beings are sinful and don't measure up. Now here's concept number two. And concept number two is this. And this one is really hard, I think, for people to swallow, especially Americans. Because God is righteous and just, this results in my punishment, namely death. Now hang with me on this one for just a second. A few years back, you might remember that there was a really famous case, but let me remind you of what it was. There was a young man, a Stanford student, I believe, by the name of Brock Turner. And one day on the way home from a party, there was a young girl who was intoxicated. He took advantage of her and he assaulted her. And tragically, the physical and emotional pain for her will follow her for years, if not the rest of her life. The typical sentence for that is probably about 3 to 5 years, if I understand correctly. Instead, the judge only sentenced him to 6 months in jail, and he was out in 3 months on good behavior. And now, what accounts for such a lenient sentence? Well, the judge, the grounding in that decision, you know what the reasoning he gave was? He says, well, I mean, we wouldn't want one decision one foolish decision in one moment that a young man made to ruin so many years of his life, and we wouldn't want it to interfere with his swimming career because he happened to be the captain of the swimming team at Stanford. And what's ironic there is the judge says one decision shouldn't ruin years of this young man's life, and yet that's exactly what happened to that young woman. And so, quite rightfully so, people in the press, they weren't just ticked off at Brock Turner. As a matter of fact, he was more quickly forgotten. The judge became the most hated person in the media for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was dragged. He was even kicked out of his career, as I understand it, because of that. Now, here's what we're saying. God is not like that judge. He can't look down at anything that's destroying the people in the world that he loves. And he can't look down on things like racism and abuse and injustice to the poor and wars. And he can't look down on all of that with indifference or say, well, I wouldn't want this to ruin things for them. God is a God who has to do something about that because he's not like that judge. And so you see, the reason that God judges sin, it's not because he's not loving. It's precisely the opposite. It's that he wouldn't be loving if he didn't care. And this results in my punishment, namely death, because I'm actually on the wrong side of that line. And that brings us to concept number 3. Here's the third big idea. Good works won't work. You see, all of us agree that there's certain people that ought to be punished. God has to do something about Joseph Stalin. He has to do something about Adolf Hitler. But it gets really, really complicated when we start figuring out where to draw the line. One thing I do with a lot of people is I invite them to do this exercise where we have a list of sins and they order them from most harmless to most harmful. And then I say, I want you to draw a line as for where God has to do something about that. And something I find really fascinating is that by default, we tend to put our sins on the more harmless side of the list, and we conveniently tend to draw that line right beneath what we've actually done. And everybody has a different line, but it seems like we all have that in common. And I want you to ask you, why do you draw the line where you do, that a good God would have to do something about these things and not others? Is it because you actually believe that's the most fair thing and that these things do harm in the world and these things don't? Or is it because, metaphorically speaking, you don't think that a couple decisions that you made should have to ruin your whole life? And metaphorically speaking, it's because you've got a swimming career to concern yourself with. We've got a life. The wages of sin is death. If there's a good God, and I'm part of the problem of what's destroying what he loves, he has to have a problem with me. And if he's the one sustaining my life, then of course being cut off from him, what else could it be but death? And that's a terrifying idea, one that people run from all the time. Now that's all sin, but here's the good news. We get to the second category of ideas, and that's salvation. Here's the fourth big idea, that because God is loving and merciful, he provided a substitute. Suppose for a second that a meteor were to smash into the earth right now and all life as we know it ended. I know, rather bleak. But we all suddenly find ourselves at the gates of heaven. Now, I don't think heaven has gates. It's not a gated community. They're not trying to keep the skateboarders out or something, but let's just say that it does. And at that gate, you've got St. Peter, and this isn't his job, but you just go with me for a second. St. Peter's got a clipboard, and there's 2 angels that are big and muscular like bouncers at the door. And he's got a filing cabinet, and in that filing cabinet is everything you or I have thought, said, or done. Now I get to the front of that line, and he's like, Dave, Boscher, 2 S's, B-O-S-S-C-H, okay. And he pulls out my file. He has one look inside. It doesn't take him very long to go, dude, this is not going to fit here. And you know what? You're part of the problem, and God has to do something about that. And he points to those 2 big angels next to him. And he says, we've got to get rid of this guy. He'd be right to do that. Now, if it's just a matter of that being paid for, probably the best thing I can hope for is maybe you step up behind me in line and say, wait, I'm willing to die for him. I'm willing to pay that off. Now, that's what God does for us, except that presents a number of problems. And this leads to the next big idea. Idea number 5, that Christ's nature, he is the perfect substitute. For one thing, if there's a dispute between 2 people, there's only one way for it to get resolved, and it's between me and God. Either I've got to pay something back and fix what's gone wrong, or the other person has to absorb the cost. That's how reconciliation always works. So a third party really can't enter in. And yet Jesus Christ, because he is fully God, is able to stand in the place of God and say, I'm going to take this on myself. But the other problem is this. I mean, also you'd step up and that St. Peter would look in your file and it would be just as dark as mine. And he'd go, you've got your own sins. to pay for. But Jesus Christ is perfect because he lived the life that you and I haven't lived. Jesus was sinless and perfect. But then let's suppose you are perfect. You step up and say, okay, I'll die for Dave. But even then, what about the next person in line? We are all out of perfect people. Because Jesus Christ was God, by the power of his eternal capacity, he was able to pay not just for one person's sins, but for everybody's sins. And that's why Jesus Christ is the perfect substitute. Now, here's the next big idea: Christ's work, his death, and his resurrection. Every tenured professor of history in the entire Western world agrees that Jesus Christ was a real, living, breathing human being. We also know that Jesus Christ died at the hands of the Roman authorities. But his work was that he lived the life that I didn't live. By all accounts, Jesus Christ was perfect. And he willingly, not reluctantly, willingly went to a death that he easily could have gotten out of, but he chose not to on my account. And on that cross, he paid the price I deserve. He cried out on that cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in that moment, do you remember what the penalty was? It's death. Jesus Christ, I should have been cut off. I'm the one who's cut myself off from God. And if he sustains my life, I should be falling apart physically, spiritually, eternally. And Jesus Christ took that disintegration on himself. He was cut off in my place. And so he endured everything that death could throw at him. Now, anybody can die, but not anybody can come back. We know where Muhammad is buried. We know where the Buddha was cremated. We have no idea where Jesus was buried because he didn't stay there long enough for anybody to care. And because he rose again, I know that my enemies of sin, Satan, and death really have been dealt with. It really has been paid. And this leads us to our next big idea, and that is salvation by faith. In the book of Ephesians, it says that salvation is a gift of grace through faith, and this not of yourselves, that no one can boast. Now, this is a little hard because Christians are really confusing on what they mean by faith. Sometimes we use the word faith as a way of saying, well, just suspend your rational thinking and just believe something for no particular reason. I like to think of it in that case as the trump card of sort of the insecure pastor that doesn't really have the answer to your question but doesn't want to admit it. The Bible never uses the word faith that way. Instead, it means two things. It means trusting God with your life, and it means trusting God to save your life. So for one thing, to be back in relationship with God, you have to understand that in that final analysis, the kingdom of heaven will be a place of surrender. Put differently, if God holds your atoms together right now, this is not somebody who's going to come into your life to be your butler. And you might not want perfectly for God to own every part of your life, but that is his goal. In his goodness, that's his goal. And the first thing you have to say is, God, I trust you with my life. I don't trust you perfectly, but I want you to have everything. In the final analysis, I want you to take that. Now, here's the second thing that faith is. Faith is trusting Jesus to pay for and forgive all of your sins, past, present, and future. Every one of us, by default, seems to look to certain qualities about ourselves that we think is going to make God owe us. But what Jesus did on the cross, if it's received, it's not received by works that you merited it. It's going to be received simply by this, by faith, so that you can't boast. It's just trusting that his death was sufficient and nothing else. It's saying, Jesus, I will never get there. I will never be good enough. I'm giving up on my self-salvation project, and I'm just trusting you. And that's all it really takes. That's what grace is. It's a gift. Finally, concept number 8, saved to do good works. You may have noticed that you're not yet the sort of creature, even if you do believe in the gospel, that would be fit for heaven. And two things happen. For one thing, God buys the right to make you something that he calls a new creation, that the old is gone, the new has come. And it hasn't fully taken hold yet. But when God has forgiven your sin, he's purchased the right to strip everything out of you that would destroy paradise, all of it. And he promises to kill off that sinful nature, and that actually it starts dying even right now that he changes your heart. And look, super religious people who think they can be good enough for God and Christians will indeed both start trying to live better lives, but the motives and the power behind it are dramatically different. A legalistic person changes their life because, well, they want to be able to look down on other people, or they want God to owe them good things. A Christian, on the other hand, it's gratitude. Suppose for a second that you were drowning in the middle of the ocean and a whole group of sharks circles around about ready to eat you. But at the last moment, a boat comes out of nowhere and saves you and brings you back to shore. Now, your life just suddenly got very precious, and you're more grateful for it than you have ever been. And the sun seems like it's shining brighter, and you're kinder and gentler to everybody because your whole life feels like a gift. Now, if this story of what Jesus said is, if this is all true, then you and I, something infinitely better has happened to you and to me. And we don't change somehow because we have to do that to get God to owe us stuff. We do it because He's already received us. And every time we forget our status, it's as simple as going back to the edge of the ocean and remembering what's happened and putting our lives in context. You see, that's the power of the grace. That's what changes a person. It's the Holy Spirit killing off and taking away the old person and making you into something new. And it's that gratitude that flows from the cross that can really change you. So I don't know who you are. I don't know what change you want in your life. I don't know what brings you to this right now, but I want you to know that if this is true, and I believe it is, there's something amazing here for you. So, what were your head level hangups as you listen to this? What intellectually doesn't make sense to you? And on a gut level, what about this is there that bothers you, that you have a really, really hard time believing? I want you to know that those things are worth reasoning through. And my goal and my prayer for you, it's okay if you disagree with me in the end, but I either want you to come and love Jesus or I want you to at least know why you don't. So I look forward to talking to you again. For now, God bless and have a good day.